Good morning to everyone in the United States. Good afternoon in Europe. Hello to you all over the world. And thank you to our in-person audience here at our Atlantic Council headquarters in Washington, D.C. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and it's my special privilege this morning to welcome you to the Atlantic Council special event, As Long as It Takes, the European Union's support for Ukraine. And this is 3 days after the anniversary of Putin's criminal unprovoked war in Ukraine. Our speakers will be Ambassador Stavros Lambrinidis, Ambassador of the European Union to the United States, Ambassador Oksana Markova, Ambassador of Ukraine to the United States, representing the Swedish EU presidency, Ms. Ingrid Ask, the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy of the Kingdom of Sweden in the United States, and then the moderator is Ryan Heath of Politico. But I also want to draw the attention particularly to people who aren't in this amazing in-person audience, to the virtual audience. We have ambassadors in the room from Luxembourg, from Spain, from the Czech Republic, from the Slovak Republic, from Denmark, from the European Union, from Ukraine, as I mentioned, Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, Croatia, Moldova, and then we have DCMs, we have representatives from almost every European Union country. So it's a real show of support on this anniversary. We solemnly mark 1 year since Russia began its full-scale, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, a dark chapter in Ukraine's national story and Europe's history. By launching this major offensive last year, Vladimir Putin openly declared his imperial ambitions to strip Ukraine of its sovereignty, its democracy, and its right to existence. For Putin, Ukraine was to be another step in his revanchist policy against Europe and transatlantic security. We've seen tens of thousands of lives lost and millions displaced. We've witnessed the uncovering of countless atrocities committed against the people of Ukraine, atrocities that Vice President Kamala Harris recently labeled crimes against humanity at the Munich Security Conference. But Putin has failed. Today, 1 year on, Ukraine stands. Ukraine stands at the epicenter of the fight for our values and backed by the unrelenting support of North America, Europe, and its partners around the globe. Victory for Ukraine is victory for us all. The Ukraine story is one of resistance and hope. Resistance from the imperial ambitions of a foreign leader who denies a people's and a nation's existence, and hope for Ukraine whole and free, at peace that controls its own future. We shouldn't forget that in the Revolution of Dignity of 2014, almost a decade ago, Ukrainians waved flags of the European Union in Kiev's Independence Square. A lot of people forget that. They waved flags of the EU, and they've sacrificed themselves for what that flag represents: democracy, freedom, and respect for human rights. And today we're here to bear witness to Ukraine's fight for freedom and to discuss Europe's support for Ukraine in this fight. The President of the European Commission has doubled down on the EU's support to Ukraine, promising to be by Ukraine's side as long as it takes. Alongside US leadership, the European Union and its member states have supported Ukraine in its struggle and mobilized over 37 billion euros in financial and humanitarian aid and 12 billion euros in military support. With unity and swiftness that few anticipated last February, the EU leveled successive rounds of historic sanctions against the Russian state. Finally, Ukraine is now a candidate for membership in the European Union. It sits squarely on a path toward Western integration. There's still plenty of work to be done. In a weekend newsletter, I wrote about President Biden's historic trip to Kiev last week. Some have compared it to President Kennedy's Ich bin ein Berliner moment. Some have compared it to President Reagan's tear down the wall moment. And I said that in some respects that undersold the moment, and in some respects it oversold it. It undersold it in the sense that President Biden took real risks that President Kennedy and President Reagan didn't have to take on their trips to Berlin. It oversold it in the sense that the reason that those speeches are famous now is Berlin stood. Berlin remained free. the wall did come down. And so now we have to deliver on the intent that President Biden delivered in Kiev last week and then in Warsaw last week, and what the European Union has been doing all along. Since the beginning of the invasion, the Atlantic Council has remained firm in its commitment to the people of Ukraine. The war has brought us back to our core mission we were established over 60 years ago to promote, that we are stronger together and that the transatlantic partnership must remain front and center. We've mobilized across our 16 programs and centers. Our Eurasia Center leads our work on Ukraine. Our Europe Center shapes discussions on how Europe must and is changing across the board. Our Global Energy Center focuses on the energy dimension and Europe's energy decoupling from Russia. The Geoeconomic Center leads work on sanctions. The Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security leads on NATO's support for Ukraine and the military elements. Our Geographic Centers covering regions across the world have brought Ukraine's story to all aspects of the work. So as we mark this solemn anniversary, we keep the Ukrainian story front in mind. Against that backdrop, it is my honor to welcome for this discussion the Ambassador of Ukraine, Oksana Markarova, the Ambassador for the European Union, Stavros Lambrinidis, and the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Swedish Embassy, Ms. Ingrid Osk, for a conversation on Europe's support for Ukraine and Ukraine's future with Europe. It'll be moderated by Politico's editorial director, Ryan Heath, who we're always delighted to have here at the Atlantic Council. Ambassadors, thank you for being here, and Ryan, over to you.
Thank you, Fred. Let's dive right into it. I'm going to turn to you first, Ambassador Markarova. What is the view of the state of the war 9 years into Russia's attempted occupation in Ukraine, and where do we need to focus now with weapons and aid deliveries?
Thank you. Yes, as we passed 1 year and 9 years of the regional attack of Russian Federation, on the one hand, the situation is really difficult, and I think everyone who looks, this is the very long front line. This is still very much a situation of the threat everywhere in Ukraine with the either Shahid drones or missiles or whatever Russia can find, even after the sanctions are working and preventing them from building quicker something new. So the situation is still very difficult, and all the help, security assistance, budget assistance, and tougher sanctions for Russia is still number 3 priorities that we have been talking for all this year. So we have been able to retake more than 50% of the territories that Russia initially occupied. Yes, we didn't allow them to take Kyiv in 3 days. Yes, we almost survived this horrible winter when they have destroyed more than 60% of the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. But we did not win yet. So we cannot rest today and say, great, you know, it's already an achievement that Ukraine is here and standing strong during this year. It is remarkable achievement of the brave people of Ukraine, of our defenders, of our partners here in the United States and in Europe who were able to stay the course with us. But we have to double down. We have to do more now. We have to finish this war as soon as possible, not only because it will save lives of Ukrainians. Of course, it's existential for us. But also, if we want to stay together, close, and move to how we recover after it, together, us, Europeans, Americans, we have to end it faster.
To follow up, what's your fear that if we don't defeat Putin in this war now in Ukraine, what do you fear for the rest of Europe?
Well, unfortunately, at this time, it's not what we fear, it's what we know. Putin is a threat, not Putin, Russian Federation is a threat to so many of us, to everyone who believes in the values of democracy and freedom, but also to anyone who simply thinks that territorial integrity and sovereignty is sacred. So I don't think any of us would want to live in the world in which a large, aggressive, autocratic country can attack a neighbor and get away with it. So I wouldn't even put it in terms of what are we afraid. I mean, as we say in Ukraine, we crossed that bridge already. We are not afraid anymore. We just have to fight and we have to win. But I think all of us should be concerned if we will not win it fast. It's the right thing to do. It's the most effective and efficient thing to do because it's going to be much more expensive and much more difficult. if Putin will go beyond Ukraine, and believe me, Russian Federation will go beyond Ukraine if they are not stopped in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And also, this war has taken a toll on Ukraine, of course. We are paying the ultimate price for it, but it's taken a toll on Europe, on the United States, on everyone. So the faster we can win this war, mm-hmm. the faster we can move to the stage of recovery, all of us.
Ambassador Lambrinidis, can you put in a little bit of context for people who maybe don't follow exactly what the EU is doing in this war effort and the EU's member governments, where obviously we see large weapons deliveries from the US, also some from the EU, but you're in a different form of front line in terms of energy impact, in terms of refugees, in terms of being neighbors to Ukraine here. So give us a little bit of the context of where the EU effort is now and how difficult it has been to mobilize that.
The EU effort is massive when it comes to military aid, when it comes to economic aid, when it comes to humanitarian aid, and when it comes to refugee aid. And in many ways that is complementary to what the United States is doing. In other ways, it is on the same parallel track. But I think the main message I want to give is that it would have been impossible for America alone to have provided what Ukraine has needed up to now to be able to fight and push back. Mm-hmm. And it would have been impossible for Europe to have done that alone without the United States. It is this alliance that has made it happen. And also a number of other countries around the world that I want to emphasize. You're right to say that in our case, when you impose sanctions as massive as we have on Russia, which have a very, very big effect on Europe, much bigger than they do in other parts of the world, because our trade and investment relationship, inevitably, you cannot defy gravity, with Russia has been much higher than others. That there we need 27 prime ministers and presidents to be unanimous in approving them. Yeah. It's not just a matter of one president signing a piece of paper. So I think that the 10th package that just took place of another 11 billion, in addition to everything else, is of critical importance, highlighting the unity that the EU has to build. Now, it's not easy because there are many more things in this puzzle, although the most important thing is supporting Ukraine and Ukrainians. We have to deal with world crises that were created by this attack, whether it is the food insecurity or whether it is the energy crisis that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. And those crises, in the eyes of countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia, are what determines their approach to this war. Mm-hmm. So whereas for us it's pretty clear what is happening here, that an autocrat sitting on a nuclear weapon cannot win, because if he does, that ensures that the American and the European democracy's footprint in the world is diminished for decades to come. So this is existential for both. Mm-hmm. For other countries in the world, it's other stuff. Mm-hmm. And there, and I'll close my answer with this, Ryan, I'll tell you, we have been setting up food solidarity lanes in the EU to allow for food to come out of Ukraine when the ports were being bombed and blocked. Mm-hmm. Another 22 billion has gone to the Ukrainian economy just for that, in addition to the 73 billion that we have committed already as Europeans. But when we talk to other parts of the world, what I say is this. I say, look, this is not a war of the West against Ukraine, okay? It's the war of the West and the East, of the North and the South, to support Ukraine and the UN Charter, because if there is one colonialist power in the 21st century, that's Russia. Now, many of us committed colonialism in the past. Mm-hmm. We learned from that terrible, terrible, terrible mistake. Putin not only has not learned from it, but he's using it. He's using the same tools, the same philosophy to wipe a country he doesn't like off the map and to control it. That, to me, is unacceptable, and the world has to understand that this is an existential fight for all of us, not just for the Ukrainians or the Europeans, the Americans, for the Africans, for the Asians, for Latin Americans, and we have to be effective in getting that message across.
And a question for everyone really, how close are you all to winning that case that this is an existential threat to everyone? And I ask the question because there's lots of layers in these alliances, and not everyone in Africa has seen it as an existential threat to them. But then on the other hand, you have, for example, the Lithuanian foreign minister yesterday saying specifically that unless there's a complete Ukrainian victory, there can't be lasting peace in Europe. So you've got one layer of potential or real allies seeing this as sort of peripheral or wanting something pragmatic as a solution. And then you have the point of the Lithuanian foreign minister, which backs up what you were saying, that this is existential, and that there can't be compromise. How do we thread those needles? Maybe I'll bring you in, Ingrid.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ryan, and I'm very glad to be here with the ambassadors Markarova and Lambrinidis, and I'm particularly glad that the focus today is on Europe, really. I mean, Ukraine belongs to Europe, and that we're looking ahead towards the European path here. And for Sweden, as the presidency country in the European Union, this is the backdrop, and it permeates everything that we do right now. I totally agree with the ambassadors that this is existential for not only Ukraine, but also for Europe as a whole and for our European identity, really. What kind of union we want to be, how we see our future, and how we're handling it. Our role right now as a presidency country is, of course, to contribute to that unity among member states. I think it has been extraordinary, the unity that we have shown, imposing sanctions. I think we probably surprised President Putin. We might have surprised even our American colleagues that it went so fast and so in such a comprehensive way. But I also want to bring up, I mean, this is about our own identity, but a very important task is, of course, to mitigate the global repercussions of this when it comes to food security and energy.
So you have to have two parallel arguments. It's two
Yes.
campaigns at once, really.
Yes, yes, true. Well, that's really true.
Ambassador, how does that feel in Ukraine? You're at once closer than ever to the EU, but still a long way from membership. Can you talk about the tensions there, where, like, yes, great success over the past year, but it's not everything that you've wanted, and it's not everything that you need to have this complete victory?
Well, look, we Ukrainians are very patient. We are coming back to Europe after 400 years of occupation. So the ties between Ukraine and Europe has always been very solid, but we did not have the statehood for such a long time. But since 1991, the European integration path, whether it was massively supported by the people or not, like it was at the beginning, you know, people did not know, it was the only strategic path Ukraine ever had. There were fluctuations with the pro-Russian governments which wanted to go back to Russia, and Ukrainian people decisively said no every time it happened. So since 2014, since the Revolution of Dignity, when people literally died on Maidan with a European flag in addition to Ukrainian flag, it has been a task. And I think we're doing, I would say, a remarkable job, not only defending the country, fighting on the front line, but actually implementing all the reforms. And I think we don't talk enough about it. But the fact that we are continuing all the reforms, the fact that the recent EU-Ukraine summit recognized the progress in all the areas, from very difficult judicial and rule of law reforms to economic reforms, in addition to defending the country from the actual full-fledged war, is showing how dedicated Ukrainians are to the European path. But just to touch upon your previous question also, how effective are we to getting the message outside? Because, of course, we are Europe. We feel ourselves European already, and thanks to our European colleagues, to all the ambassadors, and we have so many in the audience also with us here, this is very important for us. But Ambassador already said, it is our anti-colonial war. It is our war for independence, which we are having for a long time. And I think the recent vote in UN, the 141 votes, have shown that regardless of a very strong Russian propaganda, regardless of very strong efforts of Russia to undermine, the majority of people get it. Yeah. And we just need to work more, and we need to inform them better, and we need to also clearly show that Russia has nothing to offer to them. Look, they are trying to get military equipment from North Korea and Iran, not to mention the food, not to mention the energy, and there is nothing they can offer with regard to the development and economic development of the countries.
Yeah. Let's bring up a really practical case study on this point, Turkey. So Turkey do think they get something out of staying close to Russia. They're blocking you from joining NATO. What are your respective thoughts there on how to get more out of Turkey? They haven't been hopeless. They have helped with the grain deal, for example, but they're not where we want them to be as NATO allies, is what I'm guessing is the core of your answer. Can you elaborate a bit more on where we go next with Turkey?
Well, we are in constant discussions with Turkey because, of course, it is a NATO member and a very important one. It has mediated for the UN grain deal, and that was an important mediation. But it's also in the crossroads of sanctions and the capacity that we have to ensure that they do not get evaded, which is the new focus now of the European Union and the United States. And there, a lot of work needs to be done. Fundamentally, in order to be able to be as successful as the Ukrainian ambassador very correctly described, we have to be able to, in all fronts, not just do the right thing, but make sure the right thing that we do is implemented fully. Sanctions is a classic example. They are bringing back Russia's economy by a generation. Putin is dipping as deep as he can in his reserves right now to make sure the ruble remains stable, and he can have a narrative back in his country that everything is okay. Everything is not okay. But it would have been even worse, and it will be even worse, if we were able to shut all those sanctions evasions around the world. So this is something that, of course, we're talking to Turkey about. It is a constant effort, Ryan, to ensure that the fundamental message here, which is that if someone can so blatantly use force to take over someone else, and if their goal, the stated goal is to undermine the peace architecture that we have built up in the past 70 years, if that person wins, the world blows up. I don't know where it goes, but I do know that I cannot allow a bully to make me capitulate. No. And I also have to use all my weapons, from sanctions to support, in a way that has the maximum effect. So, Oksana, we are thinking, as you know, discussing every day about how to get you not just the support we have up to now, but more, including in weapons that can get to the point that you say you have to get, and I agree with you.
Just briefly still on Turkey, because it is a sore point for Sweden at the moment. What else could Sweden do to loosen Turkey up here to get NATO membership? Or do you have the practical benefits of NATO membership already? Because the intent is really the point, and we just move forward with the intent and figure out the official details later on.
I'd like to start with the latter part of your
Please.
question. So now we're perfectly convinced that we will contribute to the net security of the alliance, to the stability of the alliance. You know what the map looks like. It's very clear when you look at it. There are the missing pieces in Northern Europe. It's Sweden and Finland. We have the capabilities, we have the location, very important, and also the industry base that makes us, a natural part of the alliance, and we will contribute. So there is no question about that from our side. We will become members. We have a process with Turkey, and you're well aware of it. We have been addressing the concerns that Turkey has in all different aspects of it, legislation, and we fully recognize these concerns about how to handle the terrorist threat in Europe, in Turkey, in Sweden and elsewhere, but also when it comes to arms sales, and also actually how we treat Turkey and other countries, for that matter, as partners to the European Union, because they are an important partner not only to the alliance, of course, to the European Union, but of course also within NATO. We have done that, and we have delivered on all the points in the memorandum that was set up with Finland and Turkey and Sweden. Now it's a matter of time, and we'll see where it brings us, but we are hopeful, and we trust that we will become members. And of course, we were talking about the changed security architecture in Europe. I think you cannot overestimate the fundamental consequences of Russia's behavior on that security architecture. In our own case, it made us abandon 200 years of military non-alignment, and in a matter of months, really reappraise our own security architecture and decide to join NATO with, I should say, very solid support also, both within the Swedish population, but also within the Swedish parliament. So I think that is clearly a testament what this means for us.
Ambassador, have you got any input on the Turkey question?
I will give you the input on the NATO.
Please.
I think Ukraine was the very skilled, under difficult circumstances, battle-tested, very capable army. With the reforms that we are doing, with our devotion to democracy and willingness to fight for it, would make an excellent member of the NATO alliance.
And we've got a lot of support for that in the audience here. Ambassador Lambrinidis, would you agree?
I answered, you mean the Turkey question, I was the first to answer it.
Yes, and then on the NATO membership.
I will talk about the EU membership, and I will say this. I will say that President von der Leyen and President Michel visited Kiev recently for the summit. They've been there a number of times during this war. And what they recognized, all member states, is the remarkable efforts and progress that Ukraine has achieved in the extremely difficult process of changing the whole country to meet European Union standards in the middle of a war. Yep. Now, if you needed any proof of the extremely high level of the government efforts in Ukraine, the people who are engaged in this, you have it right there. Yep. So my hope is that this continuing is going to be a very effective and perhaps a faster process that you've seen in other cases.
On this point, the EU institutions, I know them and love them dearly from my time working in them.
Well, you're saying this with a little smile on your face.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that the institutions, it's not hard necessarily to win an argument amongst people that live and breathe these problems every day. So the institutions sometimes are ahead of their publics or have more political space to maneuver than a national government does. So my question is really, how do we keep that gap as narrow as possible on this path towards Ukrainian EU membership? So we don't end up in a situation, which has happened before, where some people feel they've done all the right things to meet the membership tests, get very close to being accepted, and some of those countries still aren't members today. So how can we keep that gap narrow so that Brussels is not out ahead of European publics and you get what you want at the end of the day, which is the EU membership?
Well, we have to have constant proof of the concept. And the concept is that Ukraine's coming closer and closer to the EU before even the full membership provides direct benefits to the Ukrainian people and to the EU. If you look right now what we're doing with the energy grid and how we have connected it so that Ukraine actually does not have to rely anymore on Russia to get its energy, but can rely on Europe to be able to bring energy in as its infrastructure is being bombed, that is a concrete example of what is happening and will be happening in all different fields of activity in the next years. Our commitment to support Ukraine to make all the changes it needs to is ironclad, including the funding that goes in it, including the expertise that is required. We are working arm in arm in this. It is a process. It's a merit-based process. It is not an automatic thing. But if you were to ask me, are the institutions here ahead of the public opinion? Not even close. I think the public opinion in Europe recognizes that Ukraine is part of Europe, that Ukrainians, I mean, the mere bravery is inspiring everyday people in Europe. It would be a point of pride to be able to welcome Ukraine in the European family fully.
Does Stockholm feel the same? Your job is keeping that unity together for this 6-month window of your presidency.
No, definitely. I couldn't agree more. It's very clear that this is a commitment also, both on the EU side and on the Ukrainian side, the European path forward for Ukraine. And I think also, in addition to what Ambassador Lambrinidis said, I'd say that this is also important as a signal to the Ukrainian people that this is where you belong. We are ready to engage with you on a long-term basis and to work with you on all the different steps to achieve reform, to work with you. And also important to point out here in the United States that this is an undertaking of the European Union to work with Ukraine. But also, I guess, to boost morale also on the battlefield, that this doesn't stall, this continues the European accession.
In other words, this is not anti-Russia, it is pro-Ukraine.
Right.
Yep.
Even when Russia gets out, the pro-Ukraine element will continue.
And I just want to comment, as the former Minister of Finance who was involved in European integration issues on that side for many years, I think we already found a new rhythm between Ukraine and European Union right now. And even institutions, of course, they're not as fast as the public opinion, but they're much faster than what it was before. But in order to make it even more faster, as surprising as it may sound, we have to get more weapons. So I think, that to win on the battlefield, to have more air defense, to have longer range, to be able to finish the war, to win in this war faster, is a very important European integration reform that we have to do, because then we can focus all the energy on this. It's very difficult, even for European institutions, to do everything they need to do to certify our reforms if they cannot get to so many places in Ukraine at the moment. So we have to keep the focus on that.
2 follow-ups on that then. So one, and it's around the fact, well, we've had 10 sanctions packages. We have endless, seemingly circular debates about which new weapon to deliver and when. And obviously there are complications. You have to train people to use this equipment. But how do we get around, it doesn't seem to me you can get around the fact that when things are done in a piecemeal way, there is a higher financial cost and a higher cost in blood, and that we just have to go bigger. So that's point number 1 I'd love your reaction to. And point number 2 is we're here in America. There are many Americans watching and in the room. Is there anything American organizations, governments, donors can do to support Ukraine to speed up its EU accession, to get ready? Is that a contribution you'd like to ask of American interests?
Well, it's what can you do? The answer is all of the above, everything that we were talking from the beginning of this full-fledged phase. But I think it's very important to stay focused on more weapons and faster, more sanctions. We will be there when Russia will stop its war. It's only up to Russia they can do it tomorrow. They can stop the war. They can get out from everywhere in Ukraine. And that's when the war will stop. And we can all focus on, of course, justice and reconstructions and everything that President Zelensky put in his peace formula plan, which has been supported widely by so many countries, But in order to do that, we have to stay focused. And if there is anything I want to ask from our friends here, from the American people who supported us, please continue this support. Please take time and write to your congressman, to your senator. Please take time to make sure that you want this. You want to feel safer, and you want this support to continue, because again, you said it, more and faster for weapons and sanctions would be more efficient, would lead us faster to the war, will be less expensive at the end of the day. It's also better for actually Russia, because the faster they will stop this aggressive war, the faster they will be able to focus on themselves, which they should, because their country is going into the Stone Ages at the extremely fast rate.
On that note, it's almost time to bring in audience questions. So I'm coming very soon, I promise, Marie. But and this is not necessarily a fair question, but my last question before we go to the audience is around what do you see for Russia? What does the West want for Russia? Russia, at some level, has to decide that for itself, but there are risks. Like, what are the risks of ultra-nationalists gaining power and being even more extreme than Putin if Putin were to go and we were to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia that has been talked about today? Have you got any views on where Russia needs to land, or how you want to see Russia to operate after this war? I'll go to you first, Ingrid.
Well, of course, it is for all of us, located close to Russia. This is a tremendous disappointment. This country could have taken another path, and it didn't. We had investment. We had some 400 Swedish companies there, no longer there, and there was potential. And the situation Russia is in now, it's very hard to see when we will have a path back towards that kind of development. It's extremely sad, really. But of course, I think one important challenge also for the EU is to do what we can to also address the repression that's taking place, both and support civil society and other voices in Russia, in Belarus, countries very close to our borders or on our borders. where we have an extremely negative development right now. And that's perhaps the most challenging, one of the most challenging tasks that we have to do what we can to contribute to something else. But it's very hard to see that happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Russia actually did not change during the past 300, 400 years. Mm-hmm. And whether it was called Soviet Union or Russian Empire or Russian Federation, this is what they did. We just tried not to notice it and do business as usual with Russia. But I think it's very clear now that it's not only Putin, it's the Russian people who also support this aggressive war. So it has to be ultimately up to Russian people what they want to do with their country, right? It's not up to us. But we have to stand with the values in which we believe. And unless they not only stop the war, but also acknowledge what they have done, not only to Ukraine, what they have done to Georgia, what they have done to people on the streets which were they poisoned in the UK, what they have done to the people on the MH17 flight, what they have done to people in Syria, and we can go on and on and on. So unless they acknowledge it, unless there is justice served, regardless of how much time it will take, we cannot renew business as usual with Russia, even after this war is won and over. So, I think we have to start Putin in the first what we all together want to do, what our plans are, and how we want to develop our relations and have a safer. If Russia wants to be part of that, they will have to work hard then to get there.
Mm-hmm. Marie, let's bring you in. Marie Jordan is a fellow here at the Atlantic Council, and you have a question for the ambassadors.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. The US leadership in Europe over the past year has been critical in supporting Ukraine, but also the European allies to face the consequences of the war. And despite unprecedented action from the EU and the European members, the feeling to many in Washington is that Europe waits for US leadership when it could take action on its own in supporting Ukraine. So my question is, in the coming months, what concrete steps you believe could make the difference in making Europe more of a leader in the transatlantic relationship, as its unity is also at stake here?
So it's a very good question, and indeed, I think everyone acknowledges that it was the intelligence that we got from the United States back in the end of 21 that allowed us to be so prepared as Europeans as well to address the invasion that came. But when it came to the sanctions, I have to tell you, at the beginning of the sanctions, what I was getting is quite the opposite reaction. My goodness, how come you Europeans are working so fast and so much more effectively and quickly and so massively on the sanctions package? And I always told people, this is not a competition. We are working hand in hand. We're in very close coordination. In some instances, Europe can move faster. In other instances, the US does, but it is what we do together in the end that makes the difference. I can tell you that we have already begun unfolding our economic package of aid for 2023. $3 billion have already gone to Ukraine in 2023. For us, this is a very, very important thing. Guys, many times, including discussions in this country, I get people trying to distinguish between financial economic aid to Ukraine during this crisis and military aid. Mm-hmm. And the fact is that financial aid is as important for the win on the battlefield as military aid is. Mm-hmm. There's absolutely no way that you can have a country crumbling back in Kiev, schools closed, pensions not being paid, energy being destroyed and not replaced, and expect that someone fighting at the front lines with a family left back will have the moral fortitude to do so. Economic aid, when Putin is trying to kill the economy and the structure of Ukraine, in addition to its people on the battlefield, is as critical. So we in Europe are very much in front of that. And of course, there is the issue of refugees. This is something, again, that I have to say as a European, I'm so deeply proud of how the doors of Europe opened immediately to 11 million people initially. Now there are about 4.5 million who have asked for temporary protection, which means that they get, schools for their children and jobs and housing and all those things. This is a huge undertaking. It's just a matter of a couple of months or 2 or 3 months. Had we failed this as Europeans, Putin would have managed to kill the spirit of the Ukrainians much faster than he ever would have hoped, and he has failed in that too. And those people are back in Europe. And of course, those children go to European schools today. But what they say is, you know what? Thank you very much for this to Europeans. We love you for this. But we didn't ask to leave our little town in Ukraine with our teachers, our friends, to go to a place that, yes, has opened their arms for us in Europe, but we don't speak the language, don't do those things. Putin forced us to do this. We didn't ask to. That is a crime. And when, speaking of children, today he's taking all these children from Ukraine and taking them to Russia to re-educate them, that is a crime. At some point, Americans and Europeans have to stop talking realpolitik all the time and understand that the strength of our democracies is not just the strength of our militaries or our economies, it's also some of our values, and it is not okay under any circumstances to be looking at this and saying, oh my goodness, can I balance this out? How is it going to go? We have to stand by these values, and that's what Europeans have been doing from day one, and Americans, and I'm proud of that.
Hard to top that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any brief follow-ups? We've got Ambassador John Herbst, who's got another question coming. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you. First, I'd like to congratulate all of our speakers on an absolutely terrific and even eloquent discussion. For your pains, however, I'm going to make life a little bit harder for you.
Oh, come on, John, you always do this. Why?
Well, it's actually for you in the first instance. Look, we've seen what I would call to be a satisfactory response from the United States and the EU to Putin's aggression in Ukraine. And satisfactory is not bad because given the extent of the challenge, that actually takes great effort. But I think we've also seen timidity in the principal European capitals, and I apologize to all the other countries when I say that, meaning Paris and Berlin, reinforcing timidity in the United States, in Washington. So here's my question. The stronger EU response that we've seen has been driven from countries more on the periphery, especially Poland, and of course a country that's no longer in the EU, Britain. And when Ukraine wins this war, which Ukraine will as long as Western support is no less than it is today, are we going to see, you might say, a partial, at least, transfer of leadership within Europe from the West a little bit to the East, including Poland, but also the two prospective new members of NATO who've shown a great deal of steel in responding to this crisis? Thank you.
Who'd like to go first?
I don't think this is for Oksana, but you can jump in. You can jump in if you want to. John, I partly accept the premise and I partly don't. In other words, what I mean to say by this is that indeed, European Union member states from the beginning of the war, approached the way that we should support and the speed we should support Ukraine from sometimes different analyses that also came out from their own histories, their own understandings, and all that stuff. But it took us maybe a nanosecond to unite immediately behind the fundamental principle that we're going to give military, economic, and refugee aid to Ukraine, all of us, and we're going to do it massively, and we're going to do it quickly. As you described, you said it's effective, efficient. I think it's more than that, but indeed, you could always hope and aspire for more. So I see this as a case in which the European Union has once again in a crisis come even closer together, whereas the premise of your question was that maybe this is an inflection point to bring us apart, and I just don't see this. I have to tell you guys, you look at the crises in the past 10 years in the EU, and I've had to deal with them in a different capacity every time, every one of them, and in each one of them, a question that I would get is this the moment the EU now collapses? Mm-hmm. Is this the moment that you split apart? And we started with the financial crisis, where again, there were very different views in Europe from different member states for different reasons of how to approach it, a difficult period. We've come out stronger as Europeans, not weaker after that, although it was tough. You look at the migration crisis, and again, for different reasons, different member states, different groups had different approaches. Again, we came out united and stronger. You look at COVID, well, you look at Brexit before that, but let's not get into that. But if you want to look at that, you look at public opinions of Europe after Brexit, and in virtually in every country, people support the European Union more than before. And again, I was getting questions, is this the moment that the EU will come apart and its cracks will show? COVID, in the financial crisis, took us a few years to get to joint response. In COVID, it took us a few months to get to a joint response. In the case of Ukraine, it took us a few days to get to a joint response in the first package of sanctions. I am zero concerned. And if what is happening is to demonstrate the comparative advantages of different member states in the way that in the way that they can handle different types of crises, that for me as the EU ambassador is great, because the strength of the EU is multiplying the strengths of member states for the advantage of all. It is our decision to give away part of our sovereignty in a common undertaking where we all not just respect, but take advantage of its other strengths. So I am super hopeful, John. I wish I weren't. And I know you may say, well, it's my job to be, but no, it's not. I mean, I'm seriously looking at the recent history, and I think that this is going to be another inflection point of a stronger European Union.
I would love the Swedish perspective here, because Sweden is a rich, advanced country. You've sometimes felt you're ahead of the EU pack, but you've made some big strategic decisions to say it can only be stronger together on at least some of these questions. So maybe the more realistic view versus the ambassador's optimist view, how much is this integration going to keep happening?
I think I'm going to give a fairly optimistic answer also, because it's an interesting question. And of course, you can see it, I mean, is the glass half empty or half full? And I would tend to see it rather the contrary, because I think what this crisis has shown is that the EU is not just 3 or 4 big countries. And as a representative of a medium-sized European country, I think it's really shown that it is not 3 or 4. It is really 27 countries, and some of whom have very, very strong voices based in a very strong also public opinion on this, and with different aspects perhaps and different histories of our own. But it has really shown the beauty of the the diversity and the fact that we are 27 countries. It's a big union, all of us very, very active on this. Just to add, I think also where we started off, that this has also made the EU think about its own identity in some really important ways, because we've had to think about where we want to be in terms of the energy question, for instance, our own energy mixes, how we handle that, our dependencies. It's linked, of course, to the also existential question of the climate question, of course. Democracy, where do we want to be and where do we want to go? So we've had to make some very deep reflection of our own, which I think has been important. And I want to finish off with something we haven't touched upon that much, but I think it's very important also for the European Union, and that's the question of accountability, because we will need to address that. We are already addressing it. We are working within the EU, but also with the ICC, Human Rights, EU and Human Rights Council, OSCE, and so forth. This will be an extremely important part of healing and being able to continue to bring those responsible to justice and to handle the accountability matter. I think that will be tremendously important.
This is actually a really great zone to get into for the last 5 minutes of the discussion. So accountability around the crimes, but also when I think of accountability in the crimes, I just think in the long term, and infrastructure is another long-term question. Maybe digital infrastructure can arrive very quickly, but a lot of the infrastructure of a country is shattered, and it's going to take tens of billions to rebuild that. So I'd love to hear thoughts on how we move forward on the accountability and where we are on that reconstruction infrastructure side of things, and what needs to be happening now, not in 5 years' time, on the infrastructure question.
So on the accountability, I think we have excellent cooperation between the US, European Union, and Ukraine on the criminal cases that we prosecute in Ukraine. And we already have more than 60,000 war crimes or related to war cases, and we have more than 14 now countries that opened their own criminal investigations, and we're sharing the evidence. We engaged as Ingrid said, in all the courts that are available to us, from the International Criminal Court to the Court of Justice to the European Court of Human Rights, the missing element is tribunal, the crime of aggression, which is the mother of this crime. And we have to also have that element if we want to really talk about a full and comprehensive accountability. So this is the priority for us now. This is what we are discussing with the US and our European partners. This is where we have to find the way to do it in the most efficient way in order to have this tribunal set up and in order to be able to not only have the accountability, but right now send a very clear message that regardless of when we win this war, the accountability is going to be there. On the reconstruction, it's very clear the path that Ukraine wants to take, and it's shared by the US and the European Union, and this start of the platform for the reconstruction, in addition to Ramstein, in addition to Energy Contact Group, is based on the Lugano principles, is where we would like to discuss it and decide on it together. But the main kind of priorities there is to build something, not to rebuild what we used to have, but build something more innovative, leapfrog into the Ukraine 2.0.1, and we can do it because even now the digital transformation of Ukraine is very deep. The energy transformation that we are going through now is very deep. We're already ahead of some of the countries that are in peace, and that what helped us actually to survive during this very difficult year. That we were able, that our financial institutions have all the information in the cloud. That regardless of where the battles were taken, people still have access to their bank accounts, which is, surprising in the full-fledged war situation. Or the energy grid that, on the one hand, big thank you to the European Union countries that they were able to get us, go through the process, which usually takes years, literally in a couple of weeks when it was needed. But we were able to preserve the infrastructure for a long time until Russians started physically destroying it everywhere. And we can go on and on and on. But we have to, the reason why we started the platform now is we have to do the fast recovery now in order to be able to sustain life, to let people stay, to let people come back also, which is very important. People are coming back, as you heard. But also start already thinking about that future massive reconstruction, which has to be done first and foremost by using the Russian money. They have to pay for what they have destroyed. So the either reparations or the assets that are seized or whatever again, because it all related to the accountability, right? But second, of course, with the massive involvement of European Union, US, private business in that effort, because again, this is something that we Ukrainians like more than we like to fight. We have shown that we can fight, but we're very peaceful bread growers and startuppers. So we really want to inspire.
The private business point is incredibly important because we think sometimes in terms of institutions and massive loan packages, but they're a smaller scale.
May I jump
just
because
as vibrant.
may I jump in just on this point?
Yes.
After Russia invaded, close to 1 million of the youngest, brightest, tech-savvy Russians left the country. And they're not coming back. In Ukraine, they're there. They are honing their skills in the tech, in not just supporting the energy grids, but also in the social media, in everything that they do. The human capital of reconstruction is as important than the monetary capital. Ukraine has it in spades. So when the war is won, I am convinced the peace will be won as well for everything that you said, but also because Ukrainians themselves are on the ground and they will grab peace by the horns as they have grabbed war by the horns.
I think that is the perfect note to end on. Thank you, Ambassador Lambrinidis, Makarova, Deputy Chef de Mission. Obviously, I want to thank you, the in-person and virtual audience. Many of you were rallying on Sunday in support of Ukraine. You've given more time today. It's important that we mark those moments. and work together as a community. So I hope this isn't the last time you all meet and talk to think about this issue. So thank you for your participation. Thank you to the EU representation for supporting the Atlantic Council to organize this event. I'm Ryan Heath. Have a great week and continue your support and solidarity for Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you.